Poland, 1944. The Third Reich's grip tightened around occupied territories like a vice, and the Catholic Church found itself squarely in the crosshairs. Convents weren't just places of prayer anymore. They were suspected hideouts, potential resistance cells, threats to the carefully constructed new order that Hitler's regime was determined to impose across Europe. And on one cold November night, when frost painted the windows white and the wind howled through the streets of Krakow like a wounded animal, the SS came knocking at the door of a small Franciscan convent tucked away in the old quarter, searching for something or someone they believed was hidden inside its ancient stone walls. Sister Maria Kolbe stood alone in the chapel when she heard the boots. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the stone corridors like a death march, each footfall a hammer blow against her racing heart. She was 28 years old, small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, with delicate hands that had spent years turning pages of prayer books and tending to the sick. But there was steel in her spirit, forged through years of watching her country torn apart, her people murdered, her faith tested in ways she'd never imagined when she took her vows at 19. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since Father Tomasz was dragged from his church on a Sunday morning and executed in the town square 3 days later. The Gestapo had been circling closer, like wolves around a wounded deer, asking questions in the market, watching the convent gates from across the street, counting who went in and who came out, noting the times, building their case brick by brick. Mother Superior Agatha had warned her that very morning during prayers, her weathered hands gripping Sister Maria's with surprising strength. The old woman was 60 years old, had run the convent for nearly 2 decades, and had seen enough of human cruelty to know when the storm was about to break. The SS suspected them of hiding Jewish children, of passing messages for the Polish resistance, of refusing to bend the knee to the Reich's authority and close their school as ordered. All of it was true. Every single accusation. In the cellar beneath the kitchen, accessible only through a hidden trapdoor covered by a heavy wooden table, 7-year-old Rachel slept fitfully on a pile of blankets, her small body curled into a ball against the cold. Her real name was Rachel Lieberman. Her parents had been taken 6 months ago, dragged from their apartment in the Jewish ghetto and loaded onto trains heading east. No one knew exactly where those trains went, but the rumors were dark enough to make even hardened resistance fighters weep. Rachel's Star of David was carefully hidden beneath the floorboards, along with her real identification papers, replaced by forged documents that identified her as Maria Kowalski, orphaned niece of Sister Agatha, Catholic by birth, Polish by blood. The chapel door burst open with such force that the ancient hinges screamed in protest. SS Rottenführer Erich Richter entered with his Karabiner 98K rifle raised, flanked by 2 other guards whose faces were hidden in shadow. He was young, maybe 24 at most, with the kind of face that might have been kind in another life. Soft brown eyes, a gentle mouth, the ghost of boyhood still visible in the curve of his cheeks. But tonight his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped. His eyes were hard as winter ice and his orders were crystal clear. Arrest the nuns, search the premises top to bottom, find evidence of treason against the Reich, and if necessary, use whatever force required to extract confessions. Sister Maria didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch. She simply turned slowly from the altar where she'd been kneeling, rosary still wrapped around her small hands, wooden beads clicking softly as they settled, and looked at him, really looked at him. Not at the uniform, not at the rifle, not at the swastika armband that marked him as an agent of the regime. She looked into his eyes, into the soul of the man beneath the costume, and that's when she noticed something the young SS guard probably hoped desperately that no one would see. His hands were shaking. The rifle trembled ever so slightly, the barrel wavering in small circles. His breath came too fast, visible in the cold air of the unheated chapel, rapid puffs of white that betrayed his racing heart. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November cold that made every breath burn. His finger, poised on the trigger, twitched with nervous energy. Sister Maria took a step forward, moving with the calm grace of morning prayer, her worn shoes whispering against the stone floor, and said the words that would haunt Erich Richter for the next 40 years of his life. "You're shaking more than I am." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it cut through the tension in that chapel like a blade through silk. There was no accusation in it, no mockery, just a simple statement of observable fact delivered with the kind of calm that comes only from absolute faith or absolute acceptance of death, probably both. Erich Richter froze. His entire body went rigid as if he'd been struck. In that single moment, the carefully constructed power dynamic shattered like glass dropped from a great height. Here he was, armed representative of the most feared regime in Europe, backed by the full military might of the Wehrmacht and the ruthless efficiency of the SS, and he was the one trembling before an unarmed woman in a worn habit. The shame of it burned through him like acid, scorching his pride, exposing the frightened boy beneath the uniform. But orders were orders. He'd learned that much in his 2 years of service. Orders were everything. Orders kept you alive. Orders kept you from thinking too hard about what you were doing. He barked commands to his men, his voice cracking slightly on the first word before he regained control. Search everything. Turn over every stone. Check every corner. Find the evidence. Find the hidden Jews. Find the resistance materials. Find something, anything, that would justify this raid and prove that his commanding officer's suspicions were correct. And arrest them all. Every sister in this convent. Load them into the trucks and take them to headquarters for interrogation. The other guards fanned out through the building like locusts, their boots thundering on the ancient floors, their rifle butts smashing open locked doors, their hands tearing through cabinets and closets and storage rooms. Sister Maria heard the crashes, the shouts, the sounds of destruction as everything the sisters had carefully maintained for decades was torn apart in minutes. She heard Sister Catherine cry out in pain when a guard shoved her aside. She heard Sister Agnes praying aloud in Latin as they dragged her from her cell. She heard the systematic destruction of her home. They found Rachel within the hour. One of the guards noticed that the heavy kitchen table sat oddly, that there were fresh scratches on the floor around it, that it had clearly been moved recently and often. He called for help, and 3 of them heaved it aside, revealing the trapdoor beneath. Rachel had woken at the first sounds of the raid and was huddled in the farthest corner of the cellar, her small hands pressed over her mouth to stifle her sobs, her dark eyes wide with the kind of terror that no 7-year-old should ever know. The guard who found her grabbed her by the arm and hauled her up through the trapdoor like a sack of grain. Rachel screamed, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the convent and drove spikes of ice through Sister Maria's heart. The little girl fought with everything she had, kicking and biting and scratching. But she weighed maybe 40 pounds, and the guard was a grown man trained in violence. He dragged her through the kitchen and into the courtyard where the other sisters were being assembled. Rachel broke free for just a moment, just long enough to run to Sister Maria and bury her face in the nun's habit, her small arms wrapping around Sister Maria's waist with desperate strength. Sister Maria held her, one hand stroking the child's hair, whispering comfort that she didn't believe herself. "It's going to be all right. God is with us. Be brave, little one. Be brave." Then rough hands tore them apart. A guard grabbed Rachel and another grabbed Sister Maria, forcing them to their knees in the dirt of the courtyard. Mother Superior Agatha was already there, hands bound behind her back with rough rope that had already drawn blood, her face swollen and bloodied from a rifle butt to the cheek when she'd tried to bar the door to the chapel. 3 other sisters knelt in a row beside her, Sister Catherine, Sister Agnes, and young Sister Teresa, who'd only taken her final vows 6 months ago and was sobbing uncontrollably. Erich Richter stood in the center of the courtyard, watching it all unfold, his rifle now lowered but still gripped tight in his white-knuckled hands. He watched Rachel cling to Sister Maria. He watched the old Mother Superior's blood drip into the dirt. He watched Sister Teresa's shoulders shake with sobs. And he felt something twist in his gut, something dark and sick that he'd been feeling more and more often lately. His finger remained frozen, unable to tighten on the trigger he'd been trained to pull without hesitation. His commanding officer, SS Hauptsturmführer Dietrich Krauss, arrived just before dawn, stepping out of a black Mercedes with the casual arrogance of a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. He was 45, a career SS officer who'd been in Poland since the invasion in 1939, and he'd seen and done things that would have broken lesser men. He surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. 6 nuns and 1 Jewish child. All the evidence they needed to justify shutting down this troublesome convent permanently. He walked slowly down the line of kneeling women, his polished boots clicking on the cobblestones, studying each face. When he reached Sister Maria, he stopped, leaned down, spoke in fluent Polish with a thick German accent. "Where are the others? We know you've been hiding more than one child. We know you've been passing messages for the resistance. Give us names and locations and perhaps we can show mercy." Sister Maria looked up at him with those same calm eyes she'd turned on Erich Richter. "I don't know what you're talking about." Krause's hand moved so fast it was a blur. The slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Sister Maria's head snapped to the side, blood spraying from her split lip. But she didn't cry out, didn't beg, just slowly turned her face back to him, blood running down her chin, and repeated, "I don't know what you're talking about." Erich Richter watched this exchange and felt his hands start shaking again. He gripped his rifle tighter, trying to stop the trembling, but it only got worse. He'd been present at dozens of arrests, had helped drag resistance fighters from their homes, had stood guard during interrogations. But something about this woman's calm, about her refusal to break, about the way she looked at her captors with something that wasn't quite pity but close to it, it was breaking something inside him that he wasn't sure could be repaired. The transport truck arrived as the sun rose, a canvas-covered vehicle that had carried hundreds of prisoners before and would carry hundreds more after. They were loaded into the back like cargo, the 6 nuns and Rachel, along with Father Piotr from a church across town who'd been arrested the same night, and 3 young men accused of being resistance fighters. 15 people crammed into a space meant for 8. Standing room only, no seats, no water, no facilities. They were taken first to Gestapo headquarters in Krakow, housed in a beautiful old Baroque building that had been transformed into a house of horrors. The elegant facade hid interrogation rooms in the basement where screams echoed off stone walls and blood-stained floors that had once hosted aristocratic balls. The interrogations lasted 3 days. They wanted names, locations, resistance contacts, safe houses, routes used to smuggle Jews and political prisoners out of the occupied territories, code words, meeting times, everything. And they had methods to extract that information that had been refined over 5 years of occupation. Sister Maria was questioned for 6 hours on the first day. They started with verbal threats, then moved to physical intimidation, then to actual violence. They beat her with rubber truncheons that left deep bruises but didn't break bones. They held her head underwater until her lungs burned and her vision went dark. They kept her standing for hours until her legs gave out, then forced her back up and started again. And through it all, she said nothing, gave them nothing, just repeated the same phrase over and over. "I don't know what you're talking about." On the second day, they changed tactics. They brought Mother Superior Agatha into the room, forced her to her knees, and put a pistol to her head. The officer conducting the interrogation, a Gestapo agent named Muller who'd perfected his craft in Poland, gave Sister Maria 1 minute to provide names or watch her Mother Superior die. Sister Maria looked at Mother Superior Agatha. The old woman's eyes were swollen shut, her face a mass of bruises, her hands shaking with pain or fear or both. But she managed a small smile and shook her head slightly. "Don't tell them. Don't break. Let me die with purpose." Sister Maria looked back at Muller and said, "I have nothing to tell you." Muller pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber with a hollow click. He laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the walls. "Not today, sister, but soon. Very soon if you don't cooperate." On the 3rd day, they brought Rachel into the room. The little girl had been kept separate, hadn't been physically harmed yet, but 3 days of terror had reduced her to a trembling shell. She saw Sister Maria's battered face and started crying, reaching out with small hands. "Sister Maria, I want to go home. Please, I want my mama." The interrogator crouched beside Rachel, his voice sickeningly gentle. "You can go home, little one. We'll find you a nice family. But first, Sister Maria needs to answer some questions. Can you help us convince her?" He pulled out a knife, let the blade catch the light. Didn't threaten explicitly. Didn't need to. The implication was clear enough. Sister Maria felt something break inside her chest. Not her resolve. That remained iron. But something else. Some last barrier between herself and the full reality of evil. She looked at Rachel. At this child she'd helped hide and feed and comfort for 6 months, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would die before she gave them what they wanted. And Rachel might die too. And Mother Superior. And all the others. But if she talked, dozens more would die. The entire network would collapse. All the children currently hidden. all the resistance fighters, all the brave people risking everything to fight back against this darkness. She looked at the interrogator and spoke in German, which she'd learned from her father years ago. Do what you will. I have nothing to say to you. Not today. Not ever. You can kill me. You can kill the child. You can kill us all. But you'll get nothing from me. The interrogator stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. We're done here. He looked at the guards. Send them all to Ravensbrück. Let the camp break them if we can't. Erich Richter stood guard during one of those interrogation sessions, the one on the second day. He was positioned outside the door, but the walls were thin and he heard everything. Every blow. Every scream, though Sister Maria rarely screamed, which somehow made it worse. Every threat. Every moment of cruelty delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. And every time the door opened, and he caught a glimpse of Sister Maria's battered face, he saw that same terrible calm in her eyes. That same unspoken truth that had shattered him in the chapel. You're shaking more than I am. He threw up twice during his shift, had to step outside into the alley behind the building, and empty his stomach while his fellow guards laughed at his weakness. He requested a transfer the next day, but it was denied. You'll toughen up, his commander told him. Everyone does eventually. This is war. This is necessary. But Erich Richter wasn't sure he wanted to toughen up. Wasn't sure he wanted to become the kind of man who could watch this without feeling sick. Wasn't sure anymore that any of this was necessary or right, or anything other than evil dressed up in uniforms and justified by orders. After the interrogations came the trains. Cattle cars packed so tight you couldn't fall down if you fainted, couldn't sit even if your legs gave out, could barely breathe through the press of bodies and the stench of fear and waste. The journey from Krakow to Ravensbrück took 2 days. No food, no water, no toilets, just a single bucket in the corner that overflowed within hours. Women sobbed. Children whimpered. The old and sick began to die within the first 12 hours. Mother Superior Agatha stood pressed against Sister Maria, her breathing labored, her injuries from the interrogations taking their toll. She prayed aloud, her voice steady even as her body failed, leading the others in the rosary and hymns and whispered words of comfort. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. By the time they reached Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany, 12 women from their transport car were dead, their bodies piled in one corner. Mother Superior Agatha was one of them. She died sometime during the second night, slipping away quietly between one prayer and the next, her final words a benediction for the sisters she was leaving behind. Sister Maria held her body as long as she could, cradling the old woman's head in her lap. But when the doors finally opened and the guards started shouting orders, she had no choice but to let go. She carried Mother Superior off the train herself, her small frame somehow finding the strength to bear the weight, and laid her gently on the platform. She closed her eyes with trembling fingers, said a final prayer over her body. Then she was shoved into line with the others, herded forward by guards with dogs and clubs. The processing at Ravensbrück was designed to strip away every last shred of dignity and identity. They were ordered to undress completely, every piece of clothing removed and thrown into a pile. They stood naked while guards walked among them, inspecting them like livestock, making crude comments, laughing at their humiliation. Sister Maria kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to preserve some small sense of modesty even as everything was taken from her. Then came the shaving. Every bit of hair removed, heads, bodies, everything, with dull razors that pulled and cut. Then the cold showers, water so cold it felt like knives against skin. Then the uniforms, thin striped dresses that provided no warmth and fit no one properly. And finally, the tattoo, a number inked onto her left forearm with a needle that jabbed again and again until the skin swelled and bled. Prisoner 42,891. That's who she was now. Not Sister Maria Kolbe, not a bride of Christ, not a teacher or a caretaker or a human being with a name and a history, just a number. Ravensbrück was hell dressed up as order and efficiency, endless roll calls in freezing cold, standing at attention for hours while guards counted and recounted, beatings for anyone who moved or fainted or couldn't keep up, starvation rations that left you dreaming of bread, a thin soup made from rotten vegetables and a slice of black bread that was more sawdust than grain, Barely enough calories to keep a body alive, let alone working. Forced labor in the camp workshops, 12 to 14 hours a day sewing uniforms for the same soldiers who guarded you, or sorting through mountains of clothing and belongings stolen from prisoners who'd been sent to the gas chambers. Disease swept through the barracks like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia. With hundreds of women crammed into barracks designed for 50, with no heat, no sanitation, no medical care, illness spread at terrifying speed. Women dropped dead during roll call and their bodies were simply dragged away. Numbers recorded in ledgers. Personal effects sorted for redistribution. Graves dug in the frozen ground by other prisoners. But Sister Maria survived. She survived because she had to, because Rachel needed her. The little girl had been sent to a different section of the camp, the children's barracks. But Sister Maria caught glimpses of her sometimes across the wire fence during roll call, and those brief sightings became the lifeline that kept her going. She survived because Mother Superior's death couldn't be meaningless. Someone had to remember. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to live to tell the story. The work details were brutal beyond description. 12 to 14 hours a day in the textile workshop, fingers bleeding from needle pricks, back screaming from hunching over sewing machines, eyes burning from the poor light and the strain. The guards patrolled constantly, clubs in hand, beating anyone who slowed down or made mistakes or simply looked at them wrong. Sister Maria learned quickly to keep her head down, to move efficiently, to become invisible, to do exactly what was required and nothing more, to conserve every ounce of energy for survival. But at night, in the barracks, she prayed, whispered prayers for the dead, for the dying, for the children, for her fellow prisoners. She prayed for the guards too, though that prayer was the hardest, the words sticking in her throat like broken glass. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Except they did know. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. Winter of 1944 into 1945 was the worst. Temperatures dropped well below freezing and the barracks had no heat whatsoever. Just the body warmth of hundreds of women pressed together on wooden bunks with thin blankets that provided almost no insulation. Women huddled together for warmth. 2 or 3 or 4 to a bunk meant for one, but still they died in their sleep, frozen solid by morning, their bodies stiff and blue when the guards came through for roll call. Sister Maria gave her blanket to a teenager from Warsaw, a girl barely 16 who was coughing blood, her lungs ravaged by tuberculosis. The girl died anyway 3 days later, but at least she died a little warmer, a little less alone. Sister Maria shivered through those nights, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might break, her body curled into a tight ball, praying for dawn. Spring 1945 brought rumors that spread through the camp like electricity. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Russians were coming from the east. Germany was losing. The war was ending. The guards grew nervous, started burning documents in great bonfires, destroying evidence of their crimes. Prisoners were being evacuated on death marches, forced to walk hundreds of miles to other camps deeper in German territory, and thousands died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or bullets when they couldn't keep up. Sister Maria was too weak to walk far. She weighed maybe 75 pounds, her body reduced to skin stretched over bones, her muscles wasted away, her organs failing. She and hundreds of others who were too sick or weak to march were left behind when the SS abandoned Ravensbrück in late April 1945. Left to die, presumably, though some whispered that the guards might come back to shoot them all before the Russians arrived. To eliminate witnesses, the Soviet army liberated Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945. Sister Maria was lying in her bunk, too weak to stand, barely conscious when she heard the shouts in Russian, the sounds of gunfire as the last few guards fled or were killed. Then soldiers were moving through the barracks, and these soldiers weren't there to hurt them. They brought food, real food, bread and soup and even some meat, though the prisoners' shrunken stomachs could barely handle it. They brought blankets and medical supplies. They brought the news that the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Sister Maria wept for the first time since her arrest. Great heaving sobs that shook her emaciated frame, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. She wept for Mother Superior Agatha, for Sister Teresa who died of typhus in February, for the thousands of women she'd watched die over the past 6 months, for the years stolen from her, for the innocence that could never be recovered, and for the simple, overwhelming fact that she was still alive. She found Rachel 3 days later when she was finally strong enough to walk with help. The little girl was in the camp hospital being treated for malnutrition and a severe respiratory infection. But she was alive. When Rachel saw Sister Maria, she burst into tears and reached out with thin arms. Sister Maria held her, both of them crying, both of them alive against all odds. The journey back to Poland took weeks. The roads were clogged with refugees, with displaced persons, with soldiers heading home, with the massive human migration that followed the war's end. Sister Maria and Rachel traveled with a group of Polish survivors, making their way slowly westward through the ruins of Germany and into Poland. What they found when they finally reached Krakow broke Sister Maria's heart all over again. The Jewish ghetto had been liquidated, its inhabitants murdered or deported. The resistance fighters she'd known were mostly dead. The convent was still standing, but it had been ransacked and used as a German supply depot. Every valuable item stolen, every sacred space desecrated, the chapel's altar broken, the stained glass windows shattered, but the walls were intact. The structure was sound, and slowly, painfully, Sister Maria began to rebuild. Other sisters who'd survived the war returned, one by one. Young women who'd lost everything joined the order, seeking purpose and community. They cleared the rubble, replaced the windows, repaired the altar, reopened the school, and they never spoke of what they'd endured, at least not publicly. The memories were too heavy, the pain too deep. Sister Maria spent the next 40 years in that convent, teaching children, caring for the sick, praying, and keeping her silence. She walked with a pronounced limp, the result of beatings that had shattered her pelvis and left chronic pain that never fully healed. Sitting caused her agony, the damaged bones grinding together, but she endured it without complaint. She had survived when so many hadn't. A little pain was nothing compared to that. She rarely spoke of the war. When students asked about the number tattooed on her arm, she would simply say, "That was from a difficult time," and change the subject. When fellow sisters tried to talk about their shared experiences, she would listen but contribute little. The memories were locked away in a deep place inside her, a place she visited only in nightmares that woke her gasping and sweating even decades later. Rachel stayed with her for 2 years after the war, until relatives in Palestine were located, and arrangements were made for her to join them. The day Rachel left was one of the hardest of Sister Maria's life, saying goodbye to this child she'd protected and loved, knowing she might never see her again. They wrote letters for years, Rachel sharing news of her new life, her education, eventually her marriage and children. She never forgot the nun who'd risked everything to save her. And then, in the autumn of 1983, a letter arrived from West Germany that changed everything. The return address was the federal prosecutor's office in Hamburg. Inside, a formal letter explained that they were building a case against former SS personnel who'd served in occupied Poland during the war. They had a name, Erich Richter. They had records of his unit's activities, including the raid on Sister Maria's convent. They had testimony from other survivors that he'd participated in arrests, interrogations, and deportations of civilians to concentration camps. Would Sister Maria be willing to testify at his trial? She was 73 years old now, her hair white, her body bent with age and old injuries. The idea of seeing him again, of facing the man who'd arrested her and set in motion the chain of events that had cost so many lives, made her hands shake for the first time in decades. But justice delayed was still justice. The truth needed to be told, even 40 years later. She wrote back immediately. Yes, she would testify. The trial was scheduled for February 1984 in Hamburg. Sister Maria made the journey by train, accompanied by a younger sister from her convent, watching the landscape roll past and remembering another train journey decades ago. But this time she had a seat. This time she had food and water. This time she was traveling freely, as a witness, rather than a prisoner. The courthouse in Hamburg was modern, clean, built after the war to replace buildings destroyed by Allied bombing. Nothing like the blood-stained interrogation rooms of 1944. The courtroom was large and formal, with high ceilings and rows of seats for observers. Journalists filled half the gallery, their cameras clicking. This trial had attracted significant media attention. Another aging Nazi facing justice for wartime crimes. Another piece of Germany's ongoing reckoning with its past. Eric Richter sat at the defendant's table, 64 years old now, gray-haired and stooped, wearing a cheap suit that hung loose on his thin frame. He'd spent the past 40 years as a shopkeeper in a small town in Bavaria, selling groceries and household goods. A quiet man who never talked about the war, who flinched at loud noises and couldn't sleep without pills, who'd built a life of careful anonymity until a researcher digging through old SS records had matched his name to war crimes and brought the federal prosecutor's office to his door. When Sister Maria entered the courtroom leaning slightly on her cane, moving slowly down the aisle toward the witness stand, their eyes met, and in that instant, 40 years collapsed into nothing. They were both back in that chapel in Krakow, the trembling young guard with his rifle, the calm nun with her rosary, the words that had burned into both their souls like a brand. The prosecutor, a thorough man in his 40s named Dr. Werner Hoffman, asked Sister Maria to describe the night of her arrest in November 1944. She spoke clearly, precisely, without visible emotion, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She described hearing the boots in the corridor, the door bursting open, the rifle aimed at her chest, the young guards shaking hands, the child torn from her arms, the interrogations in Krakow, the beatings, the train to Ravensbrück, the death of Mother Superior Agatha, the 6 months in the camp. All of it laid out in careful detail, fact after fact, building a picture of systematic cruelty and suffering. Then Dr. Hoffman asked the question that would break the courtroom wide open. Sister Maria, can you identify the man who arrested you that night in November 1944? Sister Maria turned in her seat, her eyes finding Eric Richter across the room. She pointed at him with a hand that shook only slightly. That man. I remember him specifically because when he came to arrest me, I noticed something unusual. He was shaking. His hands, his rifle, his entire body trembled, and I told him something that I've never forgotten. I said, "You're shaking more than I am." The courtroom went absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye turned to Erich Richter, and that's when he broke. 40 years of suppressed guilt, shame, horror, and self-loathing erupted all at once like a dam bursting. He buried his face in his hands and wept. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Sounds of anguish that echoed through the silent courtroom. His lawyer tried to calm him, putting a hand on his shoulder. But Eric shook him off. He couldn't stop. Couldn't hold it in anymore. He wept for the nun he'd arrested, for the child he'd helped drag away, for Mother Superior who died on that train, for every prisoner he'd guarded, every arrest he'd participated in, every moment he'd stood by and done nothing while others suffered. Through his tears, choking on the words, he managed to speak. "I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm so sorry. You were right. You were right about everything. I was shaking. I shook every single time. Every arrest, every interrogation, every transport. I knew it was wrong. I knew in my soul it was evil. And I did it anyway. I followed orders. I told myself I had no choice. But I did have a choice. I could have refused. I could have deserted. I could have done something, anything, other than what I did. And I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The judge called an immediate recess. Guards led Eric Richter from the courtroom, still weeping, his legs barely supporting him. Sister Maria sat in the witness box watching this broken old man carried away, and she felt something unexpected wash over her. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a deep, aching sadness for all the lives the war had twisted and destroyed, his included. He'd been 24 years old, barely more than a boy, swept up in a machine of evil that had used him and discarded him and left him to live with the consequences. During the recess, Sister Maria sat in a small room reserved for witnesses, drinking tea that she barely tasted. Dr. Hoffman came in to check on her, asked if she needed anything, if she was all right to continue. She nodded. "I'm fine. This is necessary. The truth must be told." When the trial resumed 2 hours later, Eric Richter had composed himself somewhat, though his eyes were still red and swollen. His lawyer made a statement acknowledging his client's guilt, expressing remorse, asking for mercy given his age and the fact that he'd lived a law-abiding life for 40 years since the war. But Dr. Hoffman was relentless, methodical, building his case piece by piece. Other witnesses testified over the next 3 days. a Polish resistance fighter who'd been arrested by Eric's unit, a Jewish survivor who remembered him from the Krakow Gestapo headquarters, documentary evidence, orders signed, reports filed, photographs from the period showing him in uniform. The case was overwhelming. Sister Maria was called back to the stand on the final day. Dr. Hoffman had one more question. Sister Maria, in your opinion, does the defendant bear responsibility for what happened to you and the others arrested that night? She was silent for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Yes, she said finally. He bears responsibility. He had choices, even if they were difficult choices. He could have refused. He could have helped us instead of arresting us. He could have warned us. Many Germans did exactly that, at great risk to themselves. Some paid with their lives for their courage. So yes, he is responsible for his actions. Then she paused and added something that wasn't required, something that came from a place deeper than justice. But I also believe that he has been punished every day for 40 years by his own conscience. I see it in his face. I hear it in his tears. He has been living in a prison of his own making, and perhaps that is a harsher sentence than any court could impose. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of crimes against humanity, specifically participation in the unlawful arrest and deportation of civilians to concentration camps. The judge sentenced Erich Richter to 8 years in prison. Though given his age and poor health, it was understood he would likely serve only a portion of that before being released on medical grounds. After the verdict was read, after Erich Richter was led away in handcuffs, still weeping quietly, Sister Maria was escorted from the courtroom by her companion sister. In the hallway outside, a crowd of journalists waited, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, everyone shouting questions at once. One reporter managed to make himself heard above the din. Sister Maria, how do you feel seeing your captor brought to justice after all these years? She stopped, leaned on her cane, and considered the question. Justice is necessary, she said slowly, choosing each word with care. It acknowledges the truth. It says that what happened mattered, that the victims mattered, that evil actions have consequences even decades later. But justice doesn't heal what was broken. It doesn't bring back Mother Superior Agatha or Father Tomasz or Sister Teresa, or the millions who died. It doesn't erase the scars, physical or emotional. It only acknowledges the truth. And sometimes, that's all we can do. Acknowledge the truth and try to live with it. Another journalist pressed forward. Do you forgive him? Sister Maria looked back toward the courtroom, where Erich Richter had disappeared from view. She was quiet for so long that the journalist thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Forgiveness isn't something you give once, and it's done, like signing a paper or making a declaration. It's something you choose every single day, sometimes every single hour. Some days I can forgive. Some days I can pray for his soul and mean it. Some days I can see him as a frightened young man caught in circumstances beyond his control. And some days I still feel the anger and the pain and the loss, and forgiveness feels impossible. But I pray for the strength to try. That's all any of us can do. Try. Keep trying even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. That's what faith means. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at the cameras one more time. I want to say something else. There were many Erich Richters in the war. Thousands of young men who followed orders, who did terrible things, who told themselves they had no choice. But there were also thousands who did choose differently, who risked everything to help, who hid Jews in their homes, who passed information to the resistance, who refused orders even when it cost them their lives. We must remember both. The ones who did evil, yes, but also the ones who chose good. Because that's the real lesson. We always have a choice. Always. The journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks. This quote would make headlines across Germany and beyond. We always have a choice. Simple words, but profound in their implications. Sister Maria returned to Poland the next week, grateful to leave the media circus behind. Rachel, now a grandmother herself living in Tel Aviv with her children and grandchildren, called to check on her. They talked for over an hour, remembering Mother Superior Agatha, remembering the other sisters who hadn't survived, remembering the terrified little girl who'd hidden beneath the floorboards, and the nun who'd protected her. "You saved my life," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion even after all these years. "God saved your life," Sister Maria replied gently. "I was just his instrument." Then God chose his instrument well. Sister Maria lived another 7 years after the trial. She continued teaching. Though her mobility decreased as arthritis and old injuries took their toll, she continued praying, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of monastic life. She continued bearing witness, speaking occasionally to students and researchers about her experiences, though never seeking attention, never positioning herself as a hero. She died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 1990, just months after the Berlin Wall fell, and the Cold War that had divided Europe for 45 years finally ended. She was 79 years old. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, former students, fellow sisters, survivors she'd helped during and after the war, and Rachel, who flew in from Israel to say goodbye to the woman who'd been more of a mother to her than her own mother had the chance to be. She was buried in the convent cemetery, in a simple grave marked with a plain wooden cross, next to the memorial stone for Mother Superior Agatha and the other sisters who'd been murdered during the war. No elaborate monument, no lengthy inscription, just her name, her dates, and a single sentence. She stood firm when others trembled. Erich Richter served 3 years in prison before being released on medical grounds in 1987. His health had deteriorated rapidly in confinement. Heart problems, severe depression, chronic insomnia. He moved to a small apartment provided by the state, lived on a minimal pension, and spent his remaining days in quiet solitude. He attended a small Lutheran church every Sunday, sitting in the back pew, praying silently. The pastor who counseled him said he spoke often of Sister Maria, of the moment in the chapel, of the words that had haunted him for 40 years. He died on November 8, 1988, 2 years before Sister Maria, of a heart attack in his apartment. He was 68 years old. According to the prison chaplain who'd visited him regularly during his incarceration and maintained contact afterward, his last coherent words before the heart attack struck were, "Tell her I'm still shaking." The convent in Krakow still stands today, rebuilt and restored. A working monastery and school. There's a small museum now in one wing documenting its history during the war. Photographs of the sisters line the walls, young faces full of hope, unaware of what was coming. Copies of the forged papers they used to hide Jewish children are displayed in glass cases. Testimony from survivors fills binders on shelves. And in the chapel, right where Sister Maria stood that November night in 1944, there's a bronze plaque mounted on the wall with a single sentence engraved in Polish, German, and English. "You're shaking more than I am." Sister Maria Kolbe to her captor, November 1944. It's a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to stand firm, even when everything inside you is trembling. It's the quiet strength of those who face evil and refuse to let it make them evil in return. It's the voice that speaks truth to power, even when power holds all the weapons. It's the faith that sustains you through the darkest valleys, the love that compels you to protect the innocent even at the cost of your own life, the hope that insists, against all evidence, that light will overcome darkness. Sister Maria Kolbe shook the foundations of a regime with nothing but her calm and her faith. And 40 years later, in a courtroom in Hamburg, the echo of those words finally brought a reckoning, a moment of truth where guilt could no longer hide behind orders and uniforms and the passage of time. Some truths take decades to surface. Some wounds take lifetimes to heal. Some questions about guilt and responsibility and forgiveness have no easy answers. But the truth always matters. Justice always matters. And the courage to speak truth, to stand firm, to choose good even when evil seems overwhelming. That courage echoes through history long after the trembling stops, long after the guns fall silent, long after the last witness is gone. The story lives on, in the convent that still stands, in the museum that preserves the memory, in the students who learn about Sister Maria's courage, in the descendants of the children she saved, like Rachel's grandchildren who carry her story forward, in every person who faces a choice between complicity and resistance, between silence and truth, between fear and faith. You're shaking more than I am. 5 words that captured a moment, defined a life, and challenged a regime. 5 words that remind us, across the decades, that we always have a choice. Always. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more untold stories of courage from history's darkest hours. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Sister Maria's incredible strength and the complex question of justice and forgiveness. Hit the like button to help others discover this remarkable testimony of faith, courage, and the enduring power of truth.